This video is on histology. Histology is defined as the microscopic study of tissues. So in the lab portion of this class, we will be looking at different types of tissue under the microscope. Now, I'm going to organize this in an outline fashion, so it'll kind of keep things a little bit easier and more straightforward in our head. Now, for histology, there are 4 main categories of these microscopic tissues. The first one we're going to look at is called epithelium. And epithelium is essentially going to be the lining of any surface. And for this, the cells are going to be very tightly packed. Now, the second type of tissue is called muscle tissue. And within that, there are 3 different types. We're going to have skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. The third type of tissue is nervous tissue. And the different things that are composed of nervous tissue are nerves, of course, but also your brain and your spinal cord. Now, the fourth and final type of tissue is connective tissue. And 4 types of tissue, it has to fall within all of these categories. So connective tissue is really everything else other than these 3 other types. All right, so keep this main outline in mind, and what we're going to do now is we're going to go into each different category or type of tissue, and we're going to break it down a little bit further and look at the details about that type of tissue. So the first type we're going to take a closer look at is epithelium. Alright, so remember that's a lining of a different surface, and these cells are tightly packed together because it's that lining of a surface. Now let's take a closer look at the different types of epithelium, okay? So within epithelium, there are 4 main types, and then some subcategories within them. So let's break down these different types. The first one is squamous. And within the squamous epithelium, you have 2 different types. Oops, you have, that's supposed to be an A. You have simple squamous epithelium. And now it's important to look at, remember, we're looking at the microscopic study of these tissues, so it's important to look at what these tissues look like under a microscope, whether you're looking at it in person or in a photograph. But I'm actually going to draw these structures out just so you can get some sort of a guide for what it's supposed to look like under a microscope. So I'm just going to add in that this is 1 layer thick, and that's what kind of sets it apart. That in addition to its shape. So I'm just going to draw it out right here. It just looks like one very thin layer of tissue. So when we say the word simple, we usually mean one layer. When we use the word stratified, we mean more than one layer. And squamous is just this like squish shaped cell. And then remember we said epithelium is the outside, or any sort of lining, tissue that's a lining. All right, so we figured out what our first type of squamous epithelium is. Now let's look at the second type. It is stratified squamous epithelium. And remember that stratified, all that means is that it's more than one layer thick. So, as you can imagine, the stratified squamous epithelium is going to look pretty similar to the simple squamous epithelium, but it's just going to be more than one layer thick. So we got the stratified, multiple layers, the squamous, which is that squished shaped cell, and the epithelium, which makes it a lining. Alrighty, so that's our first type of epithelium. Our second type is cuboidal. And we're going to have the same type of setup. So the first type of cuboidal tissue is going to be simple cuboidal epithelium. And just like we learned before, remember simple means one layer thick. Cuboidal just means it's in the shape of a cube. So it's just going to look like this, a bunch of cubes lined up in one layer. Now, what do you think this second type is going to be called? It's going to be similar to this one. So it's going to be stratified. Oops. Stratified. I almost wrote squamous again. Stratified cuboidal epithelium. And it's going to be similar to the relationship between these two. This one is going to look cuboid in nature again, but it's going to have multiple layers. So we got our first layer here. Now we got our second. That's all it is. And again, I'm simplifying this. It's going to look a little bit different on the photos, but this is just kind of like coordinating colors with general shapes to help for memorization. Now our third type of epithelium is columnar. And you know how cuboidal was cube-shaped? Columnar is column-shaped. So you guessed it, we have simple columnar epithelium, which tends to line tubes. Remember, epithelium is always a lining, and it just happens to line the tubes. And your simple columnar epithelium is going to look like little columns like this. And there's going to be a nucleus, which I'm representing with a little dot, and that's what it's going to look like under the microscope as well. And they're all going to be in one line. Now, a lot of people think that this is going to be, the columnar tissue is going to be similar to all the other ones, where there's going to be a simple and there's going to be a stratified. But it's a little bit different because there's actually a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, and I'll explain that in a moment. All right, so pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo means fake, so it's a fake stratified columnar epithelium, and you'll see why as I'm drawing it out. So these are going to look basically like columns, but a little bit different shaped, and their nuclei are going to kind of be all over the place, which is represented by those dots. Now, the reason why it kind of looks like it's a fake stratified layer is because you know how these nuclei are all in a line? These nuclei are not. They're kind of all over the place. It almost kind of makes it look like there are multiple layers along with like the different shape. And we're actually going to add in a little bit, one little cell here. There we go. You know what? This color isn't quite dark enough. Let's add in, we're gonna make it bright orange. Oops. If only I could get a pen that was working well for me. All right, we're gonna make it maroon colored. All right, so we have an extra cell on the side here, and that is called a goblet cell. And they produce mucus. Alrighty, so now we only have one more different type of epithelium, and that is called transitional epithelium. Now there aren't different types of it, like there's not a simple and stratified or a simple and pseudostratified, because it is always stratified. It's actually only in the urinary system. And it's unique because it can stretch. So it's going to look almost like there are like little curved shapes in it, so there we go. This is what it's gonna look like, almost like little ice cream cones or scoops. Okay, so remember, we are talking about, I'm gonna bring in my other paper here. We're talking about histology, and there are 4 different types of tissues. We just covered epithelium, which is the first type of tissue, and we talked about all the different 4 main categories of epithelium. Now we're going to go to the second type of tissue. All right, our second main type of tissue is muscle. And within that, we're going to have 3 different types of muscle tissue. The first one is called skeletal muscle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down the different features of each type of muscle tissue. So for skeletal muscle, the tissue is striated, which just means it's striped, and that's like how it looks under a microscope as well. It has parallel fibers and cells. It is multinucleated, meaning it has multiple nuclei. And it can be controlled voluntarily. all that means is an example of skeletal muscle is your bicep muscle, and you can decide when you want to activate that muscle. That means it's voluntary. What involuntary means is you can't control when it activates, and an example of that is the cardiac muscle in your heart, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So let's first draw out a picture of skeletal muscle. Remember, it's going to be striated, so striped, so it's going to look like this. And there's going to be a bunch of cells in it. And there's also going to be multiple nuclei. So remember, they're striped, they're parallel, they have multiple nuclei, and you can contract them voluntarily. Now, the second type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle. That is in your heart. Instead of having parallel fibers like in skeletal muscle, you're going to have branched fibers. You're going to have something called intercalated discs. And those just allow for electrical impulse to be conducted through these cells. And remember, we talked about this type of muscle is involuntary because you're not choosing when your heart beats. And the cardiac muscle is also striated, so that's similar to the skeletal muscle. And we can draw that out here. So remember, these are branched, so they're kind of coming off in different directions. That's the only thing that branched means. And they're also striated, so just like these skeletal muscle fibers, they're going to have stripes going through them. And then let's also draw out those intercalated discs that we discussed. So I'm just gonna underline those guys and then throw some intercalated discs in. Alrighty, so then our third type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle. So this is different than the other two because it's actually not striated. So we say non-striated. There's a single nucleus. The cells are actually spindle-shaped instead of similarly shaped like these. It's going to look a little bit different. And then it's also going to be involuntary. So an example of where you would find smooth muscle is in the digestive tract, or we also call it the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract. But I'll just say digestive system. And let's also draw these out. So remember, spindle shaped, so they're going to be shaped like this. And each one is only going to have a single nucleus. Alright, so now that covers all the three different types of muscle tissue. Now we're going to go back to this main outline that we started with. So remember, all the different types of tissues, we went over epithelial tissue, or epithelium. We went over muscle. Now we're going to go over the different types of nervous tissue, or like just a little more detail about the nervous tissue. So our third type of tissue is nervous. Remember, we talked about that nervous tissue is in the brain, nerves, and spinal cord. Now what I'm going to do for this is I'm actually going to draw out a nerve cell, like you're going to be able to see it under the microscope, which is similar to how we've been doing it with the other tissues. So let's draw that out. You can draw along with me. So that's the main structure of a neuron, which is a nerve cell. Now I'm going to make this part green right here. That is called an axon, which is the part of a neuron. And on the other side, we're going to have these pieces right here. And those are going to be called our dendrites. And we're also going to have this like circular type structure here, and that is our cell body, also known as the soma of the neuron. And for the neuron, we're also going to have a nucleus in the center. Now, there are different impulses that are created that travel through the neuron. So basically, this is how our nerves communicate with each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw arrows, which will represent the direction of the flow through the neuron. So I'm going to use this brown color for that. So things are going to flow into the dendrites, in through the cell body, and then out through the axon. So that's how our nerves communicate messages to each other, and we can basically transport those messages. You'll learn more about that process in physiology, but I just wanted to give you the basics here in anatomy. So that covers our third type of epithelial tissue. And again, I'm going to bring back our outline back into the picture. So for all the different types of tissues, we've covered epithelium, we've covered muscle, we've covered nervous tissue, and now finally we're on the last type of tissue, which is called connective tissue, which remember is everything else other than these three types up here. For our last type of tissue, it is connective tissue. Now, remember, this covers all different types, so there's going to be quite a bit of information or kind of different subtypes within it, so just stay with me, okay? So our first type of connective tissue is going to be fluid. And within that, we have two different types of fluid connective tissue. The first one is blood. And within that, we're going to have red and white blood cells. So I'm going to say, abbreviate that. So I'm going to say RBC, right, red blood cells. WBC, which is white blood cells. Platelets and plasma, which are just the contents of blood. The second type of fluid connective tissue is lymph. You may have heard of like your lymph nodes, commonly touched around the throat or jaw area when someone is sick. So we'll go more into detail with that when we learn about the lymphatic system. But lymph is composed of lymphatic fluid as well as lymphocytes, which are just the cells in the lymph. All right, so that covers the first type of connective tissue. Now we're going to move on to the second. The second type is called proper or fibrous connective tissue. All right, so within that, we're going to have dense proper fibrous connective tissue as our first type. Now we have a bunch of different subtypes. Now this is when it kind of gets more confusing, so stay with me and make sure you're following along with where I'm like indenting things, because that signifies a different subtype. So we have a subtype of proper or fibrous connective tissue, which is called dense proper or fibrous connective tissue. And within that, we have a few different types. So the first one is called regular. And an example of that is tendons and ligaments. The second type of dense proper connective tissue is irregular. And an example of that is the dermis, which is one of the layers of the skin, which we're actually going to learn about in our next video. And the last type of dense proper connective tissue is elastic. An example of the elastic tissue is arteries. So let's draw a picture of a couple of those. We're going to draw the irregular and irregular tissues just because I want us to be able to distinguish between them. So the regular is going to be just like it sounds like, regular in terms of quite uniformly shaped. So with just some nuclei scattered throughout. And then irregular is going to be just like that sounds as well. It's going to be kind of shaped or oriented irregularly. Just like that. Alrighty, so now we have our second type of proper connective tissue, which is loose, which is kind of easier to remember because it seems like the opposite of dense. Now we have 3 different types within this as well. So our first one is adipose, which is really just fat. Oops, our second one is called reticular. And that is, it basically supports lymph organs. And then our last type is areolar. And this areolar tissue is in a bunch of different locations, like the dermis of the skin and like part of the digestive system, but essentially it's just supportive as well. Now let's draw a picture of these different types of tissues. So adipose is going to have a very signature look. It's going to kind of be like big blobs like that with a nucleus in them. Reticular is going to be a bit messier, and it is going to be honestly just a bunch of tissues that are all organized in a seemingly random fashion because they're there essentially for support. And areolar is going to be similar, but it's just going to be less dense. So it's kind of going to look like that. So it's just going to be less dense than the reticular tissue, but the same size, sort of like randomized, disorganized orientation. Okay, so far for connective tissue, we've covered the first two types of connective tissue. Now let's cover the last type of connective tissue. So this last type of connective tissue, which is our number 3, the third type, I'm just lining it up, my extra paper below the other one to make sure we can see that it's kind of like a cohesive list here. So this is where our number 2 is. I'm going to go down to the same spot so it's organized nicely in my brain. And we're going to draw out number 3, the third type of connective tissue, which is supportive. All right, so within your supportive connective tissue, you're going to have 2 different types, just like the other ones. The first one is going to be cartilage. And there are a few different types. So we're going to look into that briefly. We're going to have hyaline cartilage, which is firm. Fibrocartilage, which is actually the discs in the back, which are little discs of fluid and tissue that are in between each one of your bones in your spine. So I'm just going to write discs in your back, and we'll learn more about that later. And then the last type is elastic. An example of that is in your ear. So similarly to what we did with a neuron, I just want to draw some cartilage cells out. So let's do that. Alrighty, so let's draw a little circle. And that is going to be our chondrocyte. Whenever we say cyte at the end of something, it usually just means cell. Now there's going to be something called a lacoon, which basically means lake, and it's gonna be in the outer area of the chondrocyte or the cartilage cell. So I'm gonna draw that in brown and write lacoon. And then there's also going to be a nucleus in the center, and that's what a cartilage cell looks like. So just making sure you're following with the coloring. I'm always going to write the word in the color that I drew the structure. So chondrocyte, I'm talking about this whole cell, it's going to be green. Within that, there are two different parts in the chondrocyte. We have the lacoon, which is this brown stuff towards the outside, and then we also have a nucleus in the middle. Now let's go over the second type of supportive tissue, which is bone. Makes sense, right? Bones are supportive. All right, so for bone, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to draw out a bone cell, or different bone cells within what we call the functional unit of a bone. So whenever I talk about the functional unit of something, it really just means that is a chunk of materials that is important for the function of that structure. All right, so let's start. What color do I want to do? Let's make this blue. So this is going to be our osteon. Remember, which I said is the functional unit of bone. So everything within here is necessary for bone itself to function. Now we're going to have osteocytes inside of there, which are bone cells. So let me draw these osteocytes out. All right. Osteocyte, which is bone cell. And within those osteocytes, remember how we have a lacoon up here? Well, we're also going to have a lacoon down here. So let's add that in. Which, remember, lacoon just means lake. And that's kind of what it looks like, is there's a little lake in the middle. Alrighty, so let's add little bullets for these so we can stay organized. I'm all about colors and organization. Alrighty, so we're also going to have little canals that are basically our osteocytes way of communicating with the center of things. But you know what, before we do that, I'm actually going to draw out another piece of this, which is going to be what we call lamella, which are rings within the osteon. So they're going to be like these big ring structures. Those are lamella, or lamella, which is rings. So remember, I was starting to say that you also have canaliculi. I always say that wrong, but they're little canals that connect the osteocytes with the center of the osteon. So I'm going to draw those. They really do look like little canals, so I'm just going to do little squiggles here. And those are our canal. If you have trouble spelling it, it's canal and then iculi. Canaliculi. Little canals that connect. And then in the center, the very last part, what we're going to have is our central canal, which I'm actually going to make a different color. For us, it's going to be this bright turquoise color. So that's our canal in the center. So remember, these are like little canals going to basically taking things to our big central canal. Which is also known as Haversian canal. And then the last thing to note here is that we are going to have at the very center, we're actually going to have a vein, artery, and nerve. So I'm just going to draw 3 little dots, and that's going to be our vein, artery, and nerve. And you'll notice throughout anatomy that it's very common for the vein, artery, and nerve to travel together with a bunch of different structures. So just as a review, this is our osteon, our functional unit, and all of the different contents within that. Now, there are a few other things about bone that I just want to address. So just a few things to note. We have something called an osteoclast, which isn't drawn here, but I just want to make a note of it. Osteoclast. And those are cells that essentially eat up bone. Or get rid of it. And then you also have osteoblasts, which create, or like they build or birth bone. And I like to think about birthing or building because it's osteoblast, which starts with a B, which is the same as building or birthing bones. So those are 2 types of different cells that will be within this bone structure, even though they're not pictured in this little model. So I'll just draw a little line there. Now, the last thing I want us to note is that in bone, but sometimes bone can be situated right next to cartilage, and a good example of that is something called epiphyseal plates. Now, these little plates are things that we actually call growth plates. So I'm going to draw a little structure of a bone right here. That's our little bone. And within that, we're going to have our growth plates or epiphyseal plates. Which are also known as growth plates. And it's important because those are cartilage. So that's a place where bone and cartilage kind of come together. And just something to note is that these epiphyseal plates made of cartilage are there because cartilage is less dense than bone. It's a lot squishier and it continues to grow. So this is important because we start off with really little bones when we're kids, and they're going to grow into much larger bones. So that's why we have these area of cartilage, these growth plates, also known as epiphyseal plates. And those are areas where bones will grow from child-sized bones to adult bones. And once someone is done growing, you're not going to have chunks of cartilage there anymore. They're actually going to turn into something called epiphyseal lines for adults. So I'm just going to draw an arrow, and then once you're an adult, it turns into epiphyseal lines, which you can see like in x-rays and stuff like that. But I just want to point that out, that that is no longer cartilage, that the cartilage has finished growing and it's just like sealed off. So they just look like little lines in adults. All right, so that covered it. We are finally done covering all the different types of tissues. So as a review, I'm going to bring in this outline one more time. We reviewed, in going over histology, we reviewed the 4 different types of tissues. So we reviewed epithelium, muscle, nervous, and connective tissue.